Hello and welcome. Tonight, we're not going to storm castles or decipher ancient scrolls. No battles, no kings, no great conquests. Instead, we'll be drifting into the quieter, stranger corners of medieval life, where lawmakers, in all their earnestness, pin down some of the most bizarre rules history has to offer. Some were funny, some were strangely poetic, and some defy understanding even now. But they were real, and they shaped the rhythm of life for generations long gone. So before we begin, if you enjoy slow, curious journeys through forgotten history, feel free to like this video or subscribe, only if it brings you peace. And let me ask, where are you listening from tonight? And what hour has brought you here? Now, find your most comfortable position. Maybe dim the lights, let the air grow still, and allow your thoughts to settle. As the world outside falls quiet, we'll step gently into a time when laws were inked with feathers. Punishments were sometimes decided by superstition, and the strangest offenses might involve a hat, a fish, or a sneeze. Let's begin. No shoes on Sundays, unless you're rich. Imagine it now, dear listener, a muddy street in a small medieval town. The bell has rung for church. The sun, such as it is, hides behind a veil of mist. People shuffle along, wool cloaks pulled tight, hands clasped in prayer, or perhaps just in hope of warmth. But look closer. At their feet. Some walk barefoot, others wear shoes. But not all are allowed. In parts of medieval Europe, it was once considered a crime for the lower classes to wear shoes on certain holy days, especially Sundays. Shoes, you see, were not merely for comfort or protection. They were a sign of status, of privilege, and the church, forever invested in order and appearances, believed that such distinctions must be preserved even in God's house. So it was that some parishes posted laws: no shoes unless you were of rank. The poor were to enter barefoot, humbly, reverently. And if a cobbler's apprentice or a milkmaid dared appear in leather slippers, that too could be punished, sometimes with a fine, sometimes with public scorn. Why, you might ask? Was it cruelty? Not exactly. To the medieval mind, hierarchy was sacred. It kept the world from unraveling. If a shepherd dressed like a lord, then what was next? A pig crowned king? A beggar blessing the bread? To maintain order, even the feet had to follow the rules. But of course, not everyone obeyed. Some would hide their shoes beneath long robes. Others would switch them at the church door. There were rumors even of a wealthy merchant's wife who once gave away her extra shoes just so the poor could walk into the nave with dignity. It's a small law, a strange law, but in its quiet absurdity, it reveals a world obsessed with appearances, where worship was measured not just in prayer, but in how many calluses you showed beneath your hem. So tonight, as your own feet rest warm beneath a blanket or stretch across the softness of your bed, think kindly of those who once walked shoeless through stone chapels, not because they lacked shoes, but because the law demanded it. And perhaps, in some way, the souls of your own life have wandered far from theirs, but not entirely apart. Duck-sized disputes and the law of bread theft, Close your eyes and picture it now. A quiet market square on a Tuesday morning, somewhere in the heart of England. The stalls are simple, canvas and wood, heavy with the smell of onions, fish, and damp wool. The baker, sleeves rolled, is just placing his warm loaves on the counter, but he's not smiling, because next to him, posted in brittle parchment, is a law. Stealing bread shall be counted a greater crime than stealing a duck. Yes, dear listener, in some corners of medieval law, to steal a loaf of bread, even out of hunger, could bring harsher punishment than if one stole an entire duck, feathers and all. You see, bread was sacred, not only the staff of life, but a product of man's labor, of the baker's skill, and of the sacred grain blessed by God. Bread theft was seen as an affront to the balance of the village, an insult to the honest work of others. Ducks, on the other hand, were messier, loud, feathery, and usually owned by someone rich enough to have more than one. If you stole a duck, it might be seen as mischievous, perhaps even a prank. But bread was serious. Bread meant hunger. Bread meant desperation. And so, the laws reflected this strange scale of morality. A man might lose a finger for a stolen loaf. But for a duck, perhaps just a night in the stocks, or a scolding from the reeve. It seems ridiculous now, doesn't it? But the medieval world wasn't only made of kings and crusades. It was stitched together with little rules like this, laws that placed flour above feathers, that measured justice not by fairness, but by symbolism. So tonight, as you rest, consider the weight of a single loaf and the quiet message tucked inside old laws, that sometimes what we value reveals more than what we punish. The crime of wearing the wrong hat. Let's drift now to a different kind of absurdity, one stitched not into law books, but into cloth, into thread and felt, and the tilt of a brim. For in the Middle Ages, what you wore on your head could determine whether you were a loyal subject or a criminal in the making. Laws across parts of Europe strictly regulated hats. Who could wear one? What kind of feather it could have? What color it must not be? Yes, hat crimes were real. One particular decree, passed in a northern town under the shadow of a crumbling cathedral, stated that no man of the cloth, nor merchant of middling rank, shall wear a hat of red felt with a peak facing west. Why west? Why red? Why at all? The answer is lost to time, but likely it had to do with symbolism. Westward peaks were rumored to invoke pagan associations. Red was often reserved for nobility or royalty, and fashion, in a time of deep suspicion, was more than style. It was signal. To wear the wrong hat was to pretend, to impersonate, to suggest a status not earned, and in a deeply stratified world, that was dangerous. Hat inspectors, yes, they existed, walked market streets and festival lanes. They eyed headwear with suspicion, especially during feast days or royal visits. A hat too tall? Conceit. A hat too wide? Deceit. A man once arrested in Bruges claimed he had simply found the offending hat on a fence post, but the law did not care. The hat was wrong, and the fine was steep. There is something oddly tender about it now. The idea that power feared fashion, that a hat perched just so could shake a system built on blood and borders. So tonight, as you lie back, hatless and free, imagine a world where even your shadow might be watched, and where a cap could be cause for scandal. The forbidden fish on Tuesdays. Somewhere near a coastal monastery, the waves roll in gently, and the sky is quiet and low. Fishermen mend their nets. Children run barefoot along the shore. But in the town square, a notice is posted. Today, on Tuesday, no one may eat eels. Yes, eels. In certain medieval towns, laws forbade the eating of specific fish on specific days. Eels on Tuesdays, pike on Fridays, no trout during Lent. These weren't dietary whims. They were legal mandates. And breaking them, that meant trouble. You see, fish were not only food, they were symbols. Religious calendars governed when meat could be eaten and when it must be avoided. The church, in its intricate web of holy days and fasting rituals, required substitutes for flesh, and fish filled that void. But as the market grew, and as some fish gained popularity, especially among the rich, even fish began to divide the classes. The eel, slick and rich in flavor, was especially sought after. Too good, they said, for ordinary Tuesdays, reserved perhaps for saints' days or royal feasts. Some towns passed laws to keep eels from being overfished. Others restricted them to monasteries or noble homes. Imagine being fined not for stealing a fish, but for simply eating the wrong one on the wrong day. A boy once caught roasting trout on a Wednesday was made to fast for 3 days in penance. Not because the fish was stolen, but because it was out of season by decree. It sounds silly now, and yet it speaks of a world where rules extended even to the supper table, where obedience was tested not just in war or work, but in what sizzled in the pan. So tonight, as your belly rests full and undisturbed, be grateful for your freedom to eat what you please. And think, perhaps, of the boy with the trout and the monks who watch from the shadows, shaking their heads. Don't die in a debt collector's house. This one, dear listener, is darker, and yet oddly theatrical. A law once stated that should a man die while visiting the home of a debt collector, his body could not be removed until his family paid what he owed. Let that settle for a moment. In other words, the body became collateral. The scene is not hard to imagine. A narrow, smoky room. A man slumped in a chair, his final breath already gone. And the debt collector, not shocked or grieving, but simply reaching for a scroll, marking the amount. Waiting. Families were forced to pay quickly. Or, and this happened, the body would be displayed. A reminder to others. A warning. The medieval world held strange relationships with the dead. The body was not merely a vessel. It was symbolic, sacred, and also practical. To die in debt was to carry shame into the next world. To die in a collector's home meant that even in death, you might be bartered with. Some towns repealed this law. Others expanded it. In one bizarre case, a woman was fined not for refusing to collect her dead uncle's body, but for attempting to sneak it out by disguising it in a cart full of onions. There's a strange hush to this kind of law, a quiet, unsettling echo, that even in life's final chapter, the footnotes of finance were never far behind. So tonight, as you drift away into dreams, know that in your time and place, the dead are left to rest and not used as bargaining chips. The old world, with all its rituals, was not always so gentle. No kissing in church, not even during weddings. Imagine, dear listener, a grand stone church, echoing with footsteps and the hush of whispered prayers. Light pours through stained glass and soft colors. A wedding is underway, garlands of rosemary, a nervous groom, a bride in borrowed linen. Vows are exchanged, hands are joined, and then nothing. No kiss, no applause, just silence. Because to kiss in church, even as part of a wedding, was in many places forbidden by law. You see, the medieval church was not only a house of God, but a place bound by strict decorum. Emotion, affection, even joy. These were often seen as distractions from holy solemnity. Laws, sometimes passed by local clergy, forbade laughter, clapping, or physical closeness within the sacred walls. The idea of a celebratory kiss? Scandalous. Instead, couples were expected to bow, nod, or in some places, simply part ways until the feast. Some priests allowed a hand to be held, but only briefly. One infamous document from a rural parish demanded that any physical contact during a ceremony be as modest as the Virgin herself. What that meant was unclear, but people obeyed. There were cases, even, where newlyweds were fined for embracing too warmly at the altar. One groom, it's said, was made to donate 2 chickens and a bolt of wool for unholy mirth. His crime? Kissing his wife on the cheek before they stepped outside. These laws seem cold now, but to the medieval mind, the church was the threshold between earth and heaven, a place where the flesh must wait, where joy had to be muted, and where love was best expressed in prayer. So tonight, as you recall a wedding, or dream of one, let yourself smile at how far we've come. Love now moves freely, even in cathedrals. But once, long ago, even a kiss was too loud for God's house. Don't let your bees trespass. In a quiet village just before sunrise, the fields hum softly with life. Dew clings to the grass. The baker yawns, and above the hedgerows, tiny figures dart from flower to flower. Bees, busily ignoring borders. But in the medieval world, bees were not just insects. They were property. And if your bees trespassed, that could be a legal matter. Medieval laws in various regions of England and France declared that bees belonged to the landowner, but only so long as they stayed within the bounds. If a swarm left and took up residence in another person's tree, that person could legally keep them. However, if the original owner could prove ownership or catch the swarm in the act of leaving, they had the right to retrieve them. Disputes were common. Neighbors argued over beehives like modern people might argue over fences or cars. Bees were valuable. They made wax for candles, honey for food and medicine, and even pollinated important crops. One law required beekeepers to follow a swarm on foot, without resting, to prove they were still pursuing their property. If they stopped to rest, the bees were considered free creatures of the wind and could be claimed by whoever housed them next. The image is almost poetic. A man jogging after a cloud of bees through fields and hedgerows, cloak flapping behind him, shouting to witnesses, "They're mine." Bees, in their wisdom, cared little for human laws, but humans, ever eager to tame the wild, wrote rules even for insects. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, imagine the soft buzz of honeybees in a meadow, and remember, even the smallest wings once stirred great debates. Hios, the law against being too noisy while eating soup. Let your mind drift now to a wooden hall. Firelight flickering across long benches, the smell of onions and barley thick in the air. Peasants and priests alike cradle clay bowls of warm broth, their spoons clinking gently, or not so gently. For in some places during the medieval period, there were actual laws, or at least recorded fines, for making too much noise while eating soup. Yes, slurping was a punishable offense. In monasteries, where silence was sacred, the clatter of a spoon or a noisy gulp was treated almost like a breach of holy etiquette. Some abbots, concerned about the vulgarity of sound, wrote strict rules in their house codes, forbidding loud chewing, lip smacking, and the dreaded slurp. A monk in 12th century Normandy was forced to spend 3 nights sleeping on the floor of the chapel for consuming broth with violent lips. But it wasn't only in the monasteries. In town taverns and communal dining halls, especially during religious feasts or official gatherings, over-eager eaters were sometimes scolded or even fined a penny for making a spectacle of their meal. Noise was linked to greed, and greed, even when it involved lentil soup, was frowned upon. Imagine being cold, hungry, exhausted from tilling frozen fields, and still needing to mind the gentle hum of your jaw. To our modern ears, it may seem excessive, but in a world where quiet was rare and table manners were a sign of self-control, the law of silence at supper meant more than just etiquette. It was a glimpse into the values of a society trying, always, to find order in the little things. So tonight, as you sip your tea or snack quietly in the dark, rest easy, knowing that no one is counting your slurps. And if you do make a sound, perhaps it is only history, echoing gently through the night. Thou shalt not weigh bread in the wrong manner. In the heart of many medieval towns stood the baker's stall, a place of warmth, of welcome, and of very serious regulation. For bread was not only a foodstuff, it was a moral issue, a civic duty, and woe to the baker who weighed his loaves in the wrong way. Across medieval Europe, laws known as the assize of bread were enforced with almost religious rigor. These rules controlled not just the ingredients or price, but the very weight of the loaf. Bakers were required to use standard weights and measures, often inspected and maintained by the local guild or reeve. And if you sold underweight bread, you could be fined, imprisoned, or worse. In some towns, Dishonest bakers were strapped to a cart and paraded through the streets with their bread tied around their necks, a public warning to others. The image is almost absurd. A man, eyes downcast, walking with a loaf swinging gently from a rope, the crowd jeering, the bread growing stale under the sun. To avoid such shame, many bakers began adding an extra piece, a baker's dozen. 13 loaves for the price of 12, just to be safe. It wasn't generosity, it was insurance. But what does it tell us, dear listener, that bread was guarded so closely? It tells us that hunger was near, that fairness mattered, that a short ounce of flour might mean one less mouth fed. In a time of want, the smallest deception carried real harm. So tonight, if your pantry is full and your bread soft and warm, think kindly of the laws that once tied loaves to necks, and the bakers who walked carefully, not just to earn a living, but to keep from wearing their work as punishment, the goose that needed a permit. Somewhere near a low stone wall, a goose honks. It waddles through a garden, neck high, feathers ruffled, a little too confident for a creature without hands. But in certain medieval towns, to own a goose, or let one wander, required a permit. Yes, even geese were subject to law. In parts of 14th century England and France, geese were seen not only as livestock, but as property that could disrupt public peace. Their noise was considered disruptive, their droppings unsanitary, and their tendency to bite children an act of borderline rebellion. Town councils passed ordinances: no more than 3 geese per household. All must be penned. Wandering geese were to be impounded, just like stray dogs, and returned only upon payment of a fine, sometimes in coin, sometimes in ale. One record tells of a woman in York who spent 3 days sweeping the marketplace after her gander chased a merchant's apprentice into a fruit stall. She claimed the goose was acting in self-defense. The court was unmoved. But behind the humor lies something tender. The law, strange as it sounds, was a way of managing community tension. In narrow streets and shared courtyards, a rogue goose was no small matter. So, as you fall into sleep tonight, let your thoughts drift past feathered creatures and cobblestone laws. There was once a time when even a honk could earn you a summons. And in that memory, somehow, is a kind of peace. The law of the wrong-sized candle. Let's return now to a quiet room lit by a single flame. The walls are cold. The air is still. But there, near the hearth, burns a candle, small, stubby, and flickering with golden light. In medieval towns, the size of a candle was sometimes a matter of law. This was especially true in places where candle merchants, yes, they were real, were part of a guild. Candles were sold by weight, not just by length, and strict laws governed the proportion of tallow to wick. Selling a candle that burned too quickly? Fraud. Making one that smoked too much? Deception. And heaven help the merchant who sold a prayer candle too small for the average rosary. Inspectors, known sometimes as viewers of wax, would visit shops to measure inventory. They carried brass rods for comparison. a dishonest candle maker might find his goods seized, or worse, be banned from selling altogether. One legend tells of a boy who carved fake candles from soap, dipped them quickly in wax, and sold them to pilgrims. His punishment? A week cleaning chamber pots at the priory. In our modern world of light at the flip of a switch, it's almost impossible to imagine candle laws. But in a time when night meant darkness and candles brought safety, prayer, and warmth, size mattered. So tonight, as your lamp glows or your screen fades, remember the strange little laws that once governed flame, and how, even in their absurdity, they helped keep the night just a little brighter. No playing dice during Lent. The morning bells toll over the rooftops of a small medieval town, echoing through stone alleyways and chimney smoke. Somewhere behind the baker's stall, near the back of the alehouse, a pair of hands clatter two carved dice across a worn wooden crate. The sound is soft, harmless. A quick roll, a low murmur of laughter. But as the dice settle, so too does the shadow of the law. Because it is Lent, and those dice are more than just playthings. They are forbidden. In medieval Europe, the holy season of Lent was taken with utmost seriousness. It was a time of reflection, abstention, and spiritual humility. A long stretch of weeks where meat was forbidden, finery was frowned upon, and pleasure in all its forms was to be set aside. Lent was about repentance. The soul was to be made lean, just like the body. And for many towns, one of the first things to go was gambling. Dice, those tiny cubes of chance and cheer, were seen as dangerous during ordinary time, but during Lent, they became outright symbols of sin. Councils and clerics alike issued bans against gaming, especially dice, which were associated not just with greed, but with temptation. It was said that dice brought idleness, that they stirred argument, even violence, and worst of all, they distracted the faithful from prayer. The laws varied. In some regions, dice could not be played publicly for the full 40 days before Easter. In others, any tavern caught hosting a game would be fined, and the owner forced to fast on bread and water for a week. Not out of cruelty, but as a spiritual correction. There are records of constables confiscating dice sets and burning them in town squares. Children were warned to avoid even watching a game, lest their souls be led astray. But the lines were not always clear. In one town, exceptions were made for games played in silence and without coin. In another, a priest famously allowed dice games in the church courtyard, as long as the players donated their winnings to the poor. The rules shifted with the wind, interpreted by abbots, reeves, and judges who each had their own ideas of propriety. And still, the dice rolled. In dusty corners, behind bread ovens, and within quiet barns, people played anyway. Quietly. Cautiously. Not for profit, they claimed, but for amusement. To pass the time as the days grew longer and the nights remained cold. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, of a friar who joined in a game one evening and ended up teaching the others a new variation involving stones and prayer beads. When caught, he merely smiled and said, "Is not the heart lightened by play too?" The law persisted nonetheless. and enforcement, though often uneven, carried weight. In one Flemish village, a young man was sentenced to carry a wooden cross through the streets for 3 days after being caught playing dice during Holy Week. Another man, a merchant's apprentice, was forced to donate his shoes to the parish after being seen tossing dice under the stairwell of the guild hall. But why such harshness? Why the fear of these tiny objects? Because the medieval mind saw symbolism everywhere. Dice represented fate, blind, uncaring chance. And during Lent, the soul was meant to turn away from the whims of the world and toward the certainty of God. To roll dice was to flirt with chaos, to laugh when others mourned, to gamble while Christ suffered. The fear wasn't really of the dice, it was of what they meant. That pleasure could thrive, even when sorrow was required. That joy might sneak in through the cracks of a pious season. Still, people played. They always have, quietly, desperately, hopefully. So tonight, as you lie in the hush between thoughts, picture those soft murmurs in the alley, the curve of a dice in a candle-lit hand, the quick intake of breath as a six appears, and the half glance over the shoulder to see if anyone, a priest, a reeve, or perhaps something stranger, is watching. You are not in danger here. You are not being judged. The days of forced penance for a harmless game are long gone, but the echoes remain. The rules written in the margins of dusty books, the warnings carved into wooden beams in taverns long vanished. Rest now. Let your mind tumble like dice through a game without winners. Let Lent and law and fear of fun drift far behind you. And may your sleep be peaceful, unpunished, unmeasured, and entirely your own. Thou shalt not wear too many buttons. Let us now wander slowly and softly through the hushed corridors of medieval fashion, not into silk-draped halls of kings, nor the armored silhouettes of knights, but towards something smaller, stranger, almost comically overlooked. The humble button. That tiny circle of bone, horn, or carved wood, stitched carefully onto tunics and gowns, could stir far more than a shrug of the shoulder. In fact, in certain parts of medieval Europe, the wrong button, or simply too many, could bring the weight of the law upon you. Yeah, but people were fined for wearing too many buttons. To us, it may sound absurd. Buttons today are purely practical, or occasionally stylish. We rarely think about them. But in a world where every thread whispered about one's station, buttons became more than closures. They became statements. And like many things that whispered of wealth and rising ambition, buttons drew the suspicious eye of medieval lawmakers. The fashion of the 14th and 15th centuries began to shift. As trade routes grew and craftsmanship improved, buttons, once rare and difficult to make, became more available. Not to everyone, never quite to everyone, but to enough rising merchants and craftsmen that noble eyes began to narrow. What had once been a mark of class, rows of bright buttons on a velvet sleeve, were now being copied, imitated, mocked, some said. In Florence, a law was passed restricting the number of buttons permitted on a man's outer garment if he was not of noble birth. The cap was six buttons, and they must be small, plain, and without gilding. In England, the rules were similar. Tailors were warned not to overfurnish coats with closures that suggested station. If they did, both tailor and client could be summoned before the local court. There's a documented case of a young merchant's son in York who wore a coat adorned with 12 polished brass buttons. He was called before the mayor, accused of dressing above his estate. His defense? He needed the extra closures to keep out the cold. The court disagreed. He was fined a silver penny and forced to wear a plain cloak for 1 month. His buttons, poor things, were removed in public by the town reeve, one by one, while a crowd looked on, half amused, half appalled. The obsession didn't stop at numbers. Some regions also dictated button material. In Paris, laws stated that bone buttons were for laborers, wooden ones for merchants. Only nobles could wear buttons of ivory or metal, especially gold. To blur those lines was to blur the lines of society, and that, in the medieval mind, was dangerous. It wasn't just about vanity. It was about order. The social fabric was stitched tight, and any thread out of place could unravel the whole. If a tanner's apprentice looked like a knight, how would the priest know who to bless first? If a washerwoman wore a gown that shimmered like a lady's, how could the steward direct his servants? Clothing wasn't just clothing. It was classification. A quiet, daily declaration of who you were. And the button? That was the punctuation mark. There's something tender, even foolish, about it all now. The idea that lawmakers spent their days counting buttons and peering at seams, measuring status with a ruler and scold. But for them, it made sense. A world without clear lines was a world filled with risk. Buttons were small, but powerful. Like coins, like words, like laws. And so the rules continued, stitched into guild records and posted on chapel doors. Tailors were watched. Button makers were licensed. There was even an account of a traveling actor troupe being denied entry into a town for excessive fastening. Their costumes too grand, too glittering. But people, being people, found ways to bend the rules. Hidden buttons under folds, double-sided seams, a second cloak over the first. And in secret, in candlelit rooms, buttons were carved with pride and stitched into sleeves with silent rebellion. So tonight, as you slip beneath covers with zippers or none at all, let your fingers rest where buttons once told stories. Imagine the soft clink of brass against linen, the hurried sewing before a feast, the pride, the fear, the foolishness, the human need to be seen and to rise, even if only by the shimmer of one more fastener. Rest easy. Your buttons are safe, your dreams unrestricted, and your sleep, thankfully, beyond the reach of tailors, mayors, and the long-forgotten fashion police of centuries past. Don't wake the town crier before sunrise. Let the streets fade to stillness in your mind, dear listener. Let the oil lamps flicker low in windows shuttered against the dark. The town is sleeping. Its people curled on straw mattresses, breath even and slow beneath patched quilts and layers of wool. The hearths are embers now. Only the dogs stir, gently, near doors bolted for the night. And somewhere, under that same velvet sky, a man sleeps too, alone in a narrow chamber above the town hall. His hat hung neatly on a peg. He is the town crier, and by law, he must not be woken before sunrise. Yes, it was a real law. In many medieval towns, the town crier was far more than a man with a bell and a booming voice. He was the mouthpiece of the authorities, the bearer of decrees, of announcements, of warnings and wonders alike. His voice was the voice of the town's soul, and it had to be rested. So important was his clarity, his energy, his unwavering tone, that in some regions, strict local laws were written to protect his sleep. No one, not a mayor, not a merchant, not even a passing noble, could disturb the crier between dusk and dawn unless the matter involved fire, plague, or an invading army. Any other concern? It had to wait for sunrise. And woe to the soul who banged on his door with news of a missing chicken or a domestic squabble. There is a documented case in Lincolnshire of a butcher who was fined 2 shillings and publicly scolded for waking the crier to report the theft of his cartwheel. The crier, roused from bed, refused to make the announcement until morning. The butcher, still angry, stood outside shouting the news himself, only to be silenced by the constable for impersonating a civic voice. But why all the formality? Why protect this one man's slumber above all others? Because in a world without newspapers, radios, or glowing screens, the crier was the only thread connecting the people to information. His voice declared market openings, royal births, plague quarantines, missing persons, and public executions. He told the town when to gather, when to flee, when to pray, when to fear. He spoke into silence and was trusted to do so with absolute precision. A tired crier might misread a proclamation, might slur a name or mix up dates. Imagine the panic of announcing that wheat prices were doubling, only to correct it later as halving, or declaring a plague in the South Quarter when it was truly in the North. These were not small mistakes. They could stir unrest, or worse. So, like a sacred bell, the crier had to remain untarnished, and sleep, in a world of labor and struggle, became a kind of civic ritual for him. His rest was everyone's safety. The law even specified certain protections. The crier's home was often situated close to the hall or chapel and placed under curfew from passers-by after dark. Children caught playing or whistling too close to his window were often warned by their parents or escorted home by the reeve. And should someone knock without cause, a fine, a formal apology. In some towns, a forced public nap as mock penance, where the offender was required to lie on a cot during daylight hours while townsfolk walked past, shaking their heads. It sounds ridiculous now, and perhaps it was. But such rules remind us just how precious communication was in those dim centuries. Words were rare and sacred, and the town crier, with his scrolls and staff, was a vessel too valuable to risk. And so, he slept. Perhaps alone. Perhaps with a wool cap pulled over his ears. Perhaps dreaming of his next speech. Already composing the rhythm of, "Hear ye, hear ye," even as his breath slowed. So tonight, as your eyes grow heavy and the quiet folds itself around you, think of that sleeping figure in a timbered room. the one who held the town's voice like a candle, who rested not out of laziness but duty, and who, in the morning, would step out into the world once more, bell in hand, voice steady, to remind the people what the world had become while they slept. And you, blessedly, may sleep without law, without fine, without fear of interruption. The night is yours, and your voice may wait until morning. Thou shalt not keep frogs indoors. It is dusk in the countryside, and the marshes near the edge of the village begin their nightly chorus, a croaking hum rising like mist into the air, folding over hedges and thatched rooftops, slipping into open windows with the quiet confidence of a well-worn song. The frogs are waking. The stars are peeking out. And in one cottage, under a low-beam roof and a flickering rushlight, a woman sets out her evening broth. She pauses to smile at a squat green creature nestled in a basket by the hearth. Her companion, her charm, her, quite illegally, indoor frog. Yes, dear listener, there was once a time and place where to keep a frog inside one's home, even quietly, even lovingly, was forbidden by law. You see, frogs in the medieval imagination were more than animals. They were omens, symbols, portents of illness, impurity, or worse, of the supernatural. Their cold, damp skins and habit of appearing where water stagnated linked them, in the minds of many, with decay and disease, and to bring them indoors, into a space considered sacred or blessed, a home, a hearth, was to invite misfortune inside the walls. But beyond the superstition, there were practical fears as well. Frogs, like rats or flies, were believed to carry pestilence. They were accused of contaminating water pots, of hopping into food storage, of attracting snakes, and so, in towns where the line between daily life and magical thinking blurred, local councils, often at the urging of churchmen, passed ordinances that prohibited the keeping of frogs within the home. The laws varied. Some dictated that frogs were not to be intentionally harbored indoors. Others went further, stating that any amphibian found within the threshold of a dwelling must be removed immediately, or else the owner could face a fine, a penance, or, in the more superstitious communities, an accusation of sorcery. One preserved account from a village near the Pyrenees tells of a woman accused of harboring unclean spirits in the form of toads. Her neighbors reported strange lights near her window and an unusually long harvest of leeks, which they attributed to her speaking kindly to the marsh creatures. She denied everything. Her punishment? A fine and a demand that her door be marked with holy chalk for 7 days. But there were also softer stories. Stories of children who kept frogs in wooden boxes beneath their beds, of widowers who spoke to them as companions, of healers who used their presence to soothe fevers or ward off nightmares. For as much as frogs were feared, they were also quietly cherished, symbols of renewal, of rain, of survival. And still, the laws remained. Perhaps the strangest clause came from a small Flemish township where frog keeping was allowed, but only if the animal could be proven mute. A croaking frog was considered a nuisance. A silent one? Possibly acceptable. There is no surviving documentation of how one proved a frog's silence. but one can imagine the nervous presentations. He's a quiet one, sir. Never a peep. Sleeps all day. Behind the absurdity, of course, lies something universal. A desire for order, for boundaries between wildness and domesticity, between nature and man. Frogs belonged in the marsh, not in kitchens, not in bedrooms, not curled against the warmth of an old woman's slippers. The law drew that line. Whether it was wise or kind is another question entirely. There are poems written in the corners of prayer books that reference the frog as a priest of puddles or a night prophet. Some monks believed their song to be a form of natural worship. Others described them as chattering demons and warned novices not to listen too long. The frog existed always in tension between blessing and curse, pest and pet. So tonight, as the real world quiets and your room grows still, think of that little green creature by the hearth, of its slow blink, its resting breath, of the woman who fed it crumbs and sang lullabies. She broke no hearts, only a law. A law meant to keep chaos at bay, though perhaps it only muted comfort instead. Rest now, dear listener. There are no frogs at your feet, no reeves at your door. The world outside may hum with strange songs, but inside, you are safe. The hearth is yours. The rules have faded, and even the frogs, if they knew, would be thankful. The turnip tax. Let us walk now into the soft rustle of the fields, where the light of the late afternoon fades golden across furrowed rows, and the quiet sound of roots being pulled from the earth marks the end of another long day's labor. Somewhere, just beyond the village, a farmer kneels in the dirt, his back aching beneath a threadbare tunic, hands stained with soil, holding in his calloused grip one more turnip. It is not a remarkable turnip. It is pale, knobbled, firm. But to the reeve who waits at the market gate, this turnip is not food, it is tax. Yes, dear listener, there once was a time, and not so long ago in the long breath of history, when a man might be taxed not on gold, not on land, not on grain, but on his turnips. In a number of medieval towns and rural manors, turnips, along with onions, cabbages, and a few other humble vegetables, were subject to special agricultural levies. This was no royal joke. These were serious rules, written in ink and enforced with surprising dedication. The turnip, with its reliability, its ability to store well through winter, and its role in the survival of the poorest villagers, became one of the most valuable assets in the peasant's patch. And valuable things, of course, were always noticed by the law. These taxes varied in form. Sometimes it was a portion of the harvest, every 10th turnip, let's say, to be delivered to the manor steward at the end of the season. Sometimes it was a market toll, wherein any turnip sold had to be weighed, noted, and marked up with a fee. In the most controlling villages, one needed a permit simply to grow more than a certain number of turnips, to discourage what they called hoarding and ensure proper market flow. But really, dear one, it was about power. One surviving record from a manor roll in Sussex details a poor widow fined for failing to report her extra row of turnips planted secretly behind her henhouse. She claimed they were for her sickly son. The steward claimed she had hidden them to avoid her duty to the estate. Her punishment was 2 days of public penance, her turnips confiscated, and a mark placed beside her name in the ledger. Another tale, whispered in the alehouses of a market town, tells of a young man who carved false turnips from stuffed linen and clay, burying them near his patch to fool the steward's tallymen. When discovered, he was made to parade through the village wearing a crown of actual turnips. His fraudulent ones hung from a stick across his shoulders. The crowd laughed, but quietly, for many of them had dreamed of doing the same. Why such absurdity, you may wonder? Because the turnip, dull as it may seem, was the beating heart of survival. It was not glamorous like wheat, not sweet like apples, not sacred like wine, but it filled the belly. It boiled into broth. It fed the pigs. It kept whole families alive when the larder was bare and the skies had turned against the grain, and the law, as always, crept into the cracks of necessity. It followed the hunger. If it could not tax your joy, it would tax your root cellar. There were even turnip inspectors, not by that name, of course, but by function. Men who walked through the market, lifting sacks and sniffing bundles, counting bulbs and checking for signs of unregistered harvest. A dishonest merchant might be forced to dump his basket in front of the reeve for counting. Too many, fined. Too few, accused of short weighing the poor. And yet, even among the absurdity, the turnip persisted. It grew in secret gardens. It sprouted in corners of forgotten fields. People bartered with them quietly, passed them hand to hand. They made soup from the skins. They carved them into lanterns. They lived. In some parts of Europe, a strange little custom arose. Turnip offerings at chapels during harvest festivals. A symbolic gesture, perhaps a prayer, or perhaps a way to say, here is what we have, and we share it freely, not by force, not by fee. So tonight, as your thoughts settle, and the day turns slowly to shadow, remember the farmer with his aching back and his quiet turnip tax. Remember the widow behind the henhouse, digging with cold fingers, and the boy with the clay counterfeits, smiling at his own small defiance. The laws have faded now. No one will knock on your door for the roots in your garden. But their ghosts linger in the way we value what sustains us, quietly, modestly, humbly. The turnip may not shine, but in the hush of the past, it fed the world. Sleep well, dear listener. And if you dream of fields tonight, let the turnips grow freely, with no steward to count them, no tally to bind them, only soil and silence, and the sweet forgetting of rules, the color blue, reserved for royal dogs. The castle grounds are quiet now. The sun has dipped beneath the trees, casting long, soft shadows over the stone walls and worn footpaths. A few servants finish their evening tasks, winding down before the stars blink awake overhead. The torches are lit one by one. A lute begins to hum a distant song. And by the kennel, nestled behind the western tower, the noble dogs stir in their straw-lined pens. They are tall, lean hounds bred for the hunt, their coats sleek, their gazes sharp. Around their necks, each of them wears a collar, not of plain leather, but dyed a rich, deep blue. Not merely decorative, not at all by chance. No, in this court, and in others like it across Europe, the color blue was reserved by law for royal dogs. It may sound whimsical, even charming, to modern ears, but this, like so many things in medieval life, was serious business. Blue was not simply a hue. It was meaning. It was hierarchy. It was a signal of privilege, so deeply rooted in the medieval imagination that to wear it, or to place it upon a creature you owned, could speak volumes about your place in the world. And if you were not born to that world, then wearing blue, or even allowing something under your care to wear it, was nothing short of a crime. The origins of this law are tangled, like many medieval edicts, in a mixture of religious symbolism, social anxiety, and economic regulation. Blue had long been associated with the Virgin Mary, a color of purity and divine grace. The dyes used to achieve the richest blues, particularly the ones known as woad or indigo, were expensive, rare, and closely controlled by guilds and the nobility. Thus, blue became a kind of textile aristocracy, visible proof of one's distance from poverty, labor, and commonness. It wasn't enough to say you were noble. You had to wear it, or, in this case, your dog did. Royal hounds, particularly those used in falconry or high-born hunts, were outfitted in blue collars, blue sashes, even tiny blue embroidered coats. It was a symbol, to the court, to the countryside, to the poor, that these animals, like their masters, belonged to a higher order. The law forbade commoners from using this color on animals entirely. To do so was to suggest an equality that did not exist. And so, laws were drafted. Some merely discouraged the practice. Others punished it harshly. In the records of a Bavarian town, a cobbler was sentenced to 2 weeks of public humiliation for crafting a set of blue dog collars for a merchant who fancied himself fashionable. The merchant protested, claiming he'd only used the blue dye because it was cheaper than green that year. His pleas fell on deaf ears. Both were fined, and the collars burned publicly, a warning stitched in ashes. Elsewhere, a tailor in Normandy was interrogated for designing a dog's outfit, a quilted blue tunic, for the daughter of a local baron. Unfortunately for him, the baron's lineage was disputed, and the council deemed the gesture presumptuous. The dog's garment was confiscated. The tailor lost his license for 6 months, but not everyone obeyed. As with so many absurd laws, the line between enforcement and rebellion blurred quietly behind hedgerows and inside barns. In secret, peasants sometimes dyed old scraps of wool in blue to fashion collars for their loyal mutts, not out of arrogance, but affection. If the lords dressed their beasts with blue, one shepherd was said to mutter, "Why not mine? Who's saved me more than any man has?" Still, It was dangerous. A traveling bard once sang a ballad about a common dog in a blue collar who outsmarted a lord's hunting hounds and led his master to safety in a snowstorm. The tale was popular and banned in more than one parish. And yet, these small acts of resistance tell us something profound. That even in a world where color was controlled, where cloth could condemn, there existed a quiet longing for freedom, for tenderness unbound by class. That a peasant might clothe his dog in blue, not to mock the king, but to say simply, "This creature matters to me." Over time, the laws softened, the lines blurred. As dye became more accessible and fashions changed, the significance of blue faded. No longer a sacred hue, but just another color among many. But for centuries, it held power. And in those centuries, a blue scrap of cloth on a dog's neck might have been all it took to mark someone as either noble or criminal. So tonight, as you lie in your own space, far from watchful reeves and blue cloth laws, picture those noble hounds, regal, elegant, adorned. And then picture the scruffy mutts on the edge of the village, trotting faithfully after their masters, tails wagging sometimes, just sometimes, with a ribbon of blue tied at the neck. Not legal, not allowed, but oh, so deeply human. Sleep now, dear listener, and if you dream of dogs tonight, may they all wear blue, and may they all be free, singing too loudly in the bathhouse. Now, let us drift away from the fields and kennels and enter the warm, tiled halls of a medieval bathhouse, a rare place of comfort in a world so often marked by labor, cold, and silence. Imagine the sound first, the steady drip of hot water from clay pipes, the hiss of steam as it meets chilled stone, the low hum of conversation as bodies soak and steam rises in soft, ghostly plumes. In this space, bare of armor, rank, or duty, people came to cleanse, not only the body, but perhaps, on the gentlest of days, the soul. But even here, where warmth and water softened the harsh corners of life, laws followed. And in one particular city, and more than likely in others long forgotten, a rule was passed: no singing above the voice of reason in the bath. The phrase was written exactly so, vague, poetic, and entirely open to interpretation. What, after all, was the voice of reason? A whisper? A murmur? A gentle hum in a tiled room that echoed every sound tenfold? The law may seem foolish, but it reveals something essential about the medieval world. Even pleasure had its boundaries, even joy. Spontaneous and unguarded was, at times, treated with caution. You see, bathhouses in the medieval period were both common and contested spaces. Not everyone had private facilities. Most people, even the well-off, relied on communal baths. These were places where neighbors gathered, strangers mingled, and the rhythms of daily life paused just for a moment. And with pause came conversation. Laughter, stories, songs. Sometimes too many. Records from a Bohemian city council describe multiple complaints lodged by bathers who had been disturbed by loud song and lewd verse while attempting to bathe in peace. In one case, A mason was said to have bellowed a drinking song with such force that it shook a nearby lamp from its perch. Another time, a tailor's apprentice reportedly sang for 40 straight minutes. Some claimed in Latin, others swore it was gibberish. Either way, fines followed. But beneath the nuisance lay something deeper. Singing, particularly in the echoing confines of the bathhouse, was seen by some as a loss of modesty, a surrender to self-expression in a place where humility was expected. After all, one bathed not only with neighbors, but often with one's superiors, magistrates, clerics, even the odd noble. To outsing them, to draw attention, that was a social misstep, no matter how sweet the voice. Some cities posted guidelines on bathhouse walls. Keep thy voice gentle, thy song clean, and thy body still. Others relied on the bathhouse attendants, known in some areas as water stewards, to maintain decorum. These stewards carried staffs, not for punishment, but for tapping the stone floors, a soft sound that reminded the noisy to quiet down. 3 taps was a warning. A 4th, and you were escorted out, damp and red-faced, into the street. Punishments varied. Fines were common. A few pence, or perhaps a portion of the bather's towel fee refunded to the offended party. In one extreme case, a particularly loud lute player was forbidden from entering any bathhouse in the city for a full year. He reportedly took his talents to the tavern instead, where no such restrictions applied. But not everyone disapproved. In quieter towns, singing was tolerated, even encouraged, so long as it was holy. Hymns to saints, psalms, songs of pilgrimage and praise. A young monk might be allowed to chant while scrubbing his feet, provided his voice did not drown out the creaking of the bucket. This, too, was part of the voice of reason, not just volume, but intent. And yet, despite the warnings, the laws, and the stewards with their tapping sticks, people sang. How could they not? In a world where laughter was suspect, where touch was restricted, where privacy was a rare luxury, the bathhouse became one of the few places where the burdens of medieval life lifted just enough to allow for a song. Imagine it now. The flicker of oil light across damp tiles, the scent of herbs, rosemary, thyme, a hint of lavender from the woman washing hair nearby, water sloshing, voices murmuring. And somewhere, from behind a misted curtain, a melody begins. Hesitant at first, then sure. Not loud, not offensive, just human. A lullaby remembered from childhood, a verse from a lost lover, a melody passed from grandmother to mother to daughter, now hummed beneath a sky of steam. Is it too loud? Perhaps, but maybe not. That's the mystery of this law. The voice of reason was never fixed. It shifted with the hour, the crowd, the mood of the steward. One man's song was another man's disruption, and perhaps that's why the law was written so vaguely. Not to stop singing entirely, but to remind, gently, absurdly, that even in joy, one must leave room for others. So tonight, as you sink deeper into warmth, let your own thoughts echo like quiet song against stone. No steward will tap the floor. No fine will follow your melody. The bath is yours, and your voice is your own. And if you hum, softly, slowly, even just in your mind, know that somewhere in the long hush of history, someone else did too. No, owning more than 3 mirrors. Let your thoughts wander now into a small, timber-framed room tucked behind a weaver's shop on a narrow cobbled street. A window lets in just a sliver of pale light, filtered through the linen curtains. The fire crackles low, and above the hearth, set neatly in a carved wooden frame, hangs a mirror, round, polished, its surface slightly clouded with age. Below it sits another, smaller one, resting on a table beside a comb and a pair of shears. And somewhere in a locked chest beneath the bed, there is a third, wrapped in cloth, seldom used. That's it, no more. For in this town, and in many like it, across the late medieval world, the law is clear. No person shall possess more than 3 mirrors. To us, dear listener, the idea seems peculiar. After all, mirrors are as common now as spoons or socks, found in bedrooms, bathrooms, tucked in handbags, or hanging from hallway walls. But once upon a time, to own a mirror was a mark of wealth, and to own more than a few was a mark of suspicion. Mirrors were precious things. The finest were crafted from blown glass, backed with tin or silver, painstakingly shaped and fitted by artisans who belonged to tightly regulated guilds. Cheaper ones were made from polished metal, bronze or steel, though they distorted the face and dulled quickly. Either way, a mirror was no small item. It was treasure. And with treasure came attention. Authorities, concerned with excess and the erosion of social order, began to pass laws limiting the number of mirrors a person could legally own. In Paris, sumptuary laws dictated that no citizen of merchant class or lower could possess more than 3 mirrors per household. In Florence, the law was more specific. Only 1 mirror could be displayed publicly in a room. The others must be stored out of sight. In Milan, a woman was fined for excessive use of reflective items, her crime listed simply as vanity. But behind the absurdity lay a deeper fear. Mirrors, it was said, invited pride, the kind of pride that twisted the soul. To gaze too long into one's reflection was to love oneself too dearly. Clerics warned against it. The devil, one preacher wrote, waits in the silver glass. There were even tales, half whispered, half believed, of spirits that lived behind the surface of mirrors, watching, waiting, mimicking. 3, then, was seen as a safe number. 1 for dressing, 1 for guests, and 1, perhaps, for travel. More than that was indulgence, temptation, a step too close to the sin of self-adoration. Records show that mirror counts were enforced by household inspectors, particularly in cities where sumptuary laws were taken seriously. These inspectors, often accompanied by a notary or town official, would enter homes and tally visible items: mirrors, jeweled combs, imported cloth. A 4th mirror, discovered without noble title, might be confiscated, its owner fined. In one extreme case, a merchant's wife in Flanders was forced to stand in the public square and declare, "I am not more beautiful than my neighbor," as penance for her illicit 4th mirror. But the law did not merely reflect vanity. It also reflected fear of change. As cities grew, and the merchant class gained wealth, old hierarchies began to shift. Nobles, long accustomed to being the only ones adorned, resented the rising elegance of those below. And mirrors, which revealed not just faces, but finery, became a symbol of that unsettling blur. Even the placement of mirrors mattered. A large mirror facing a window was seen as a sign of ambition. A mirror in a hallway, bold and centered, was considered immodest. Mirrors tucked in drawers or wrapped in cloth, those were acceptable, discreet. And yet, like most things forbidden, mirrors inspired fascination. People found ways to keep more than three, hidden in cupboards, behind curtains, beneath false panels in wooden chests. Some commissioned mirrors small enough to fit in a pocket, worn as pendants or concealed in sleeves. A traveling painter once confessed to owning 9 mirrors, each etched with designs, used to study the play of light across the human face. When questioned, he claimed they were tools, not luxuries. The court disagreed. Not all were punished, of course. The laws, like the reflections they tried to control, were often distorted. Enforcement depended on the town, the moment, the mood of the inspector. A baker with 4 mirrors might be ignored. A widow with 2 might be questioned. There was no consistency, only the persistent hum of regulation. But still, the mirrors survived. They were passed down through families, polished before weddings, kissed before partings. They hung beside doors and over cradles, not just to show faces, but to hold memory. In one story, an old woman refused to sell her second mirror even as famine gnawed at her village. "This one shows me as a girl," she said, "and I may need to remember her when the days grow darker. So tonight, as your room settles into quiet, and perhaps a mirror glimmers somewhere nearby, on a wall, on a table, beside a flickering lamp, let it shine without shame. You may have 5 mirrors, or 50. No one will count them. No one will knock on your door. The world of limits and laws, of fear and reflection, is far behind us now. And the face that looks back at you, soft in shadow and light, belongs only to you. Sleep well. The mirror is kind tonight, the law, against whistling at the moon. Now close your eyes, dear listener, and picture a village wrapped in silence. The kind of silence that only comes in the hours between candlelight and dawn, when even the roosters still sleep, and the world holds its breath beneath a canopy of stars. The moon is full, hanging heavy and pale above the thatched rooftops. A boy stands alone in the lane, barefoot, arms folded against the cool night breeze. He tilts his head, puckers his lips, and lets out a soft, spiraling whistle, a tune only the moon might hear. But almost as quickly as it begins, the sound is cut short. A door opens. A lantern flares. A voice, stern and certain, calls from the shadows, "Stop that. You'll bring it down upon us." Because in this place, and in many others like it scattered across the medieval world, there was a law both written and unwritten. No whistling at the moon. At first, it may sound like mere folklore, the kind passed from grandmother to child with a shake of the head and a whispered warning. But this belief was not just superstition. In some corners of medieval Europe, it took the form of formal rule, inked into the margins of rural law books, spoken aloud by town criers, etched into the rhythms of daily life. The reasons were many and none entirely clear. Some believed that to whistle at the moon invited madness, that the shrill, spiraling sound climbed skyward and disturbed the balance of the heavens. Others whispered that it summoned witches, that it was a call, an unknowing invitation to those who rode the night winds with ash-dusted feet and tangled hair. In one Welsh parish, the town constable kept a list of repeat offenders, not criminals or thieves, but boys and shepherds who dared to whistle beneath the moon's gaze. The punishment? Nothing harsh. A warning? A penance? A few nights without firewood, or an extra turn at the millstone. But the message was clear. Such things were not to be done. A report from a 14th century Bavarian hamlet describes a man brought before the village council for standing at the crossroads and whistling at the full moon 3 nights in a row. The villagers claimed their hens had stopped laying. A baby had fallen ill. The wind had turned bitter. None of this was directly his doing, of course, but his whistling, they said, had stirred the balance. He was ordered to kneel before the parish altar and promised never to do it again. To modern minds, it might seem absurd. But in a world where the natural and the supernatural were not so far apart, such rules made sense. The moon was not a lifeless stone in the sky. It was a force, a watcher, a thing of rhythm and mystery. Its cycles governed planting, birth, and blood. To address it directly, with voice or gesture, was to invite notice. And in medieval life, to be noticed by powers greater than oneself was seldom a good thing. Even whistling itself was treated with suspicion. In churches, it was forbidden, thought to be mocking, impious, or disruptive. In forests, it was said to draw wolves. In taverns, to whistle after a drink was to tempt fate. It was, in short, a sound untamed. And the moon, high above, was the most untamable thing of all. And so the law, such as it was, endured, passed down by word, by custom, by quiet corrections. Children were taught early, never whistle after sunset, never whistle when the moon is full, never whistle near the churchyard or the crossroads, or when the wind smells like iron. But of course, not everyone obeyed. There are stories of lovers who whistled to one another under the moonlight, claiming the tune carried further in the cool air. Of old men who whistled just to spite the silence, daring the sky to do its worst. Of girls who claimed that whistling at the moon brought them dreams of those they would marry, and did it again, week after week, until their parents caught them and burned their shoes in the hearth as punishment. In one remote village, a traveling bard was said to have stood beneath a full moon and whistled a tune so haunting that the village dogs all howled in chorus. The next morning, 3 of the village elders were found pacing the edge of the fields, unable to speak. The bard, unsurprisingly, was never seen again. But whether feared or ignored, the moon watched, and so the rule remained. Today, we whistle without thought. In kitchens, in stairwells, walking through empty streets. We whistle to fill silence, to summon memories, to amuse ourselves. The moon no longer listens, Or perhaps we no longer believe that it does. But once, not so long ago, the act of shaping your lips and sending song skyward was enough to make people pause, enough to draw the eye of the law. So tonight, as the moon rises above your rooftop, full or not, white or golden or shadowed, you may whistle if you like. There are no constables watching, no chalk marks on your door. But if you do, if you let the sound climb gently into the hush, know that you are part of something old, a tradition wrapped in fear, beauty, and wonder. And if the moon answers, well, that's between you and the stars. Rest now. The sky is listening, as it always has. But tonight, it listens kindly. No. Laughing at a funeral, unless authorized. In the hush of a stone church, lit by beeswax and shadow, where the sound of footsteps echoes like memory and the scent of incense clings to every wooden beam, the mourners gather. Black-clad, heads bowed, hands folded. The priest stands at the altar, speaking words of ash and return, of dust and resurrection. And somewhere in the back pew, a soft sound escapes. Not a sob, but a chuckle. Quiet, nervous, human. It ripples, just once. But it is heard. A head turns. A cough follows. And later, the steward of the parish approaches. "You know the rule," he says. "No laughter, not unless it is permitted." Yes, in many parts of medieval Europe, there was such a rule. One that seems both impossibly strict and deeply revealing. Laughter at funerals was forbidden, unless expressly authorized. It might seem strange to us now, in a world where grief and joy are often bound together, where we speak fondly of the dearly departed and share stories that bring smiles even through tears. But for much of the Middle Ages, funerals were sacred ceremonies, carefully scripted, deeply symbolic, and governed by both church and custom. There was little room for deviation. Laughter, in such moments, was considered disruptive, inappropriate, a crack in the solemnity, and so it was controlled. In some towns, families were allowed to petition the local clergy for what was known as a joyful remembrance. If granted, this permission allowed for a short period at the funeral, usually after the formal rites, during which attendees could tell light-hearted stories, share humorous memories, or even sing a gentle song. Without that permission, even a smile could be cause for reprimand. There are records of individuals fined or barred from future services for laughing too loudly at funerals. One chronicled incident from a village in Burgundy details a man who burst out laughing during the reading of the deceased's favorite psalm. Not from mockery, but from a private memory stirred by the words. He was made to kneel in the square the next morning and recite prayers of forgiveness aloud. The rule was not about cruelty, it was about control. Death, to the medieval mind, was not an end, but a passage, a moment of great danger and uncertainty. The soul's journey depended on the prayers of the living, the solemnity of the rites, the purity of the space. Disrupt that, and who could say what might befall the soul? Even joy, if misplaced, could become a kind of threat. But people, being people, laughed anyway, quietly, carefully. When the priest turned his back, when the incense was thickest and the candlelight too soft to see clearly. They whispered jokes beneath their breath, told stories on the walk home, clinked glasses to memories that were half sorrow, half celebration. Over time, the rules softened. Some churches even began to allow a laughter bell, a final toll rung after the service to signal the end of solemnity and the beginning of recollection. It was said that if laughter came after that bell, it would not reach the ears of the angels or the priests. But before then, laughter was dangerous. And so the law stood, quietly written in parish codes, spoken at wakes, repeated by grandmothers to squirming children. No laughing, child, not today. Tonight, as you lay still and thoughtful, let your smile rise gently. You will not be scolded. The rules are gone. But remember them, perhaps, as a sign of how seriously people once took the bridge between this world and the next. And sleep, if you can, with a little laughter in your heart, quiet, sacred, and entirely your own. Thou shalt not sell garlic on feast days. It is early morning in the village square, and the cobblestones are still wet from a night's soft rain. Merchants begin to arrive one by one, carts groaning beneath sacks of barley, stacks of rough-spun wool, baskets of apples and onions and cheese. But one stall, smaller than the rest, stands beneath a patched cloth awning, where a woman with red-knuckled hands and a cloak that's seen better years arranges her goods in careful rows. Braids of garlic, ivory and purple, tied with twine. The air grows thick with its scent, sharp, earthy, unmistakable. And then a voice cuts across the hum of the crowd. Not today. It is a feast day. You know the law. She sighs. She knew it was coming. Still she hoped. Because on feast days in many medieval towns, there was a law. Garlic could not be sold. Of all the things to forbid, garlic may seem the most unusual, even humorous. But in the carefully structured rhythms of the medieval calendar, feast days were not simply excuses for celebration. They were sacred. They were order. They were orchestrated pauses in the chaos of daily toil, meant for reflection, for reverence, and for beauty. And garlic, pungent, rude, and tied to the peasantry, did not fit. The ban on garlic was not always a matter of official royal decree. More often, it was local, enforced by parish councils, guild elders, or in some cases, the church itself. In certain regions of France and Italy, the presence of garlic at feast day markets was thought to offend the senses during sacred observances. After all, feast days meant incense, flowers, perfumed oils, and clean white cloths. Garlic, with its biting tang and clinging breath, was said to chase away angels. More practically, feast days were meant to provide a respite from the usual transactions of daily life. While not full Sabbaths, they still discouraged certain trades, particularly those tied to strong smells, coarse textures, or unclean labor. And garlic, harvested and braided by hand, often stored in dusty cellars, was associated with kitchens and hearths, not altars. There are written records, real ones, tucked into the back pages of town ledgers, that mention merchants fined for selling garlic during saints' days or holy processions. In one English village, a vendor was ordered to hang a turnip around her neck for a full afternoon as penance. the implication being that if she could not sell garlic, she might as well wear shame. In another town, a man known only as Osric the Onion was known to sneak garlic into his market stall by hiding it beneath cloth bundles labeled as parsnips. He was caught. The garlic was burned. He was told to stay home on all feast days for the rest of the year. Why the fuss, though? Why garlic and not onions or fish or cheese? Because garlic was powerful, not just in scent, but in symbolism. It was associated with medicine, with the warding off of evil, with bodily strength and lust and earthy wisdom. Healers used it in salves. Mothers hung it over cradles. Farmers fed it to oxen in cold months. It was considered protection and suspicion. To bring that energy into a day meant for spiritual elevation was, to many, a kind of disruption. It muddied the ritual. But of course, people needed garlic. It flavored their soups. It lined their shelves. It kept well. It was cheap. So they found ways around the rule. They bartered it quietly in alleyways, slipped it into baskets with other goods, claimed it was for cooking later, not for today. Some simply ignored the ban, especially in poorer areas where every coin mattered and every clove was a meal extended. There's even a tale of a priest who loved garlic so much he kept a braid of it hidden beneath his altar cloth. "The Lord made it," he reportedly told a visiting bishop, "and I intend to bless it." The bishop, unimpressed, ordered its removal. But the scent, they say, lingered for days. Not all regions were so strict. In parts of Spain and Eastern Europe, garlic was considered sacred in its own right, woven into garlands, offered at chapels, burned in small quantities during certain rites to ward off illness. There, it was not offensive. It was essential. But elsewhere, the rule held, and each time the calendar page turned to another saint's name, Saint Agnes, Saint George, Saint Apollonia, the garlic disappeared from market stalls. Not sold, not seen. Only tasted again the following day, in stew or bread or broth. So tonight, if your kitchen holds even a whisper of garlic, a clove chopped into soup, a smear on bread, a scent that lingers on your fingertips, give it a moment's appreciation, not just for flavor, but for its history, for the rules it broke, for the way it endured. And as you sleep, may your dreams be filled with the warmth of hearths and quiet markets, with the scent of things both forbidden and familiar. Garlic, after all, is nothing if not persistent, just like the people who loved it, even when the law did not. The rule of the rooster's silence. Before the sun rises, before even the faintest blue leaks into the blackness of the eastern sky, the village holds still. The baker's oven is not yet lit. The cow's udders remain untouched. The only sound, soft, distant, is a rustling wind through dry winter trees. And then, as if on cue, a sharp cry splits the silence. The crow of a rooster, full and proud, calling the world to wake. But not here, not yet. In this village, there is a rule. Roosters must not crow before the bell of the Angelus. Yes, there was once a time, and in some places, It stretched on for centuries, when even animals could be guilty of breaking the law. And their keepers, of course, bore the punishment. Roosters were everywhere in medieval life. They guarded the yard, warned of dawn, and were kept for meat and eggs alike. But they were also loud, unrelentingly so. And in towns where sleep was precious and the rhythm of the day carefully marked by bell towers, early crowing was seen not as helpful, but as rude, disruptive, and unlawful. The Angelus, a prayer said at dawn, midday, and evening, marked the sacred rhythm of the day. In places where monasteries dominated daily life, the ringing of the Angelus bell was often the first sanctioned sound of the morning. Before that bell tolled, all was meant to remain in silence, a final offering of rest to the soul, a transition between sleep and prayer. A rooster crowing before the bell? That was seen as a spiritual intrusion. There are documented cases of villagers being fined for keeping noisy beasts that disturbed the sacred quiet. A widow in Saxony was ordered to keep her rooster in a covered box each night to prevent early crowing. A boy in Kent was made to apologize publicly when his prized red cockerel woke the friars before their first chant. Some went further. In one village, the local ordinance required all roosters to be kept at least 50 paces from the church walls. In another, it was said that if a rooster crowed before the Angelus 3 days in a row, the bird was to be offered as alms, cooked and served at the monk's table as both penance and meal. Of course, the enforcement was inconsistent. Much depended on the mood of the reeve or the patience of the parish priest. Some tolerated early crowing, muttering only mild complaints. Others made examples, not out of cruelty, but out of a desire for order, for reverence, for uninterrupted rest. But as always, people adapted. Roosters were trained, covered at night, housed in barns with no windows. Some even had small hoods fashioned for them, soft cloth caps tied gently beneath the beak to muffle sound. A few clever villagers claimed their birds never crowed until they were spoken to. "I greet him," one woman said, "and only then does he greet the sun." It was not about the rooster, not really. It was about the sacred hush, the belief that silence was not absence, but presence, a space where something holy might speak. So tonight, as your own home settles into hush, and perhaps the far-off sound of a bird echoes faintly through the window, remember the roosters who waited, the ones trained not to crow until given leave, the ones who, like their keepers, learn to honor the line between darkness and dawn, and sleep on, undisturbed. The bells have not yet rung, no walking backwards on Wednesdays. The village square lies quiet beneath a sky of slow-turning clouds. Market day has passed, and the cobbles are swept clean of straw and seed husks. A child darts after a hoop, a wheelwright hammers lazily at a bent rim, and an old woman carries water home in a pail. Life moves forward, quite literally, because today is Wednesday, and here there is a rule as curious as it is unwavering: no walking backwards on Wednesdays. Of all the odd restrictions woven into the rhythm of medieval life, this one has baffled many. Found mostly in the oral customs of mountain villages, scattered parishes, and a few unusually strict monastic communities, it may seem a jest, a whimsy born of long winters and too much time. But for those who lived beneath its gaze, it was a serious affair. Walking backwards, you see, was thought to confuse not just man, but spirit. The origins of the Wednesday ban, as it came to be called in certain folk tales, stretch back into a blend of folklore, superstition, and old-world Christianity. According to the belief, walking backwards, especially on a Wednesday, a day tied to woe and mourning in several cultures, was seen as courting chaos. It invited spirits to follow. It told the universe you had lost your way. And more than that, it was said to disrupt the angels assigned to watch over you. One old text, written in a monastery in the north of England, describes the act as a sign of inversion, of turning the soul from light to shadow. In other words, to walk backwards on that day was to mock the divine order. Laws were issued in village codes and church decrees. Let no soul travel counter to the day, lest the blessing be undone. Enforcement varied, but it was often the duty of the parish warden or the elder reeve to correct such behavior when spotted. One account from a Swiss village tells of a shepherd boy who backed his cart down a hill on a Wednesday, not from mischief, but practicality. Still, the priest scolded him before Mass. He was made to turn around 3 times and walk the perimeter of the chapel as penance. In another town, a traveling juggler performed a backwards dance in the square and was promptly escorted out by the town watch. He danced in mockery of St. Mark, one note claimed, though no further explanation was offered. Children were taught early. Never walk backward on Wednesday, their mothers would whisper, tugging them forward if they stumbled in reverse. Even play was paused. Skipping games were done facing ahead. Spilled pails or forgotten bundles had to be approached anew. Never walked back toward. But like many such laws, there were those who pushed against it. In one hamlet, a blacksmith with a limp walked backwards every Wednesday on purpose, just to see if the sky would fall. It didn't, but his forge mysteriously caught fire later that month, and the townspeople nodded solemnly. He brought it on himself, they said. Elsewhere, lovers used the rule as a secret code. Walking backwards on a Wednesday evening was said to signal a longing for reunion. If one walked forward and the other backward, and they crossed paths at the chapel gates, it was believed they'd marry within the year. And in monasteries, where ritual held weight, some monks whispered that walking backwards could undo a sin if done slowly, prayerfully, and only on Wednesdays, the day of Judas, the day of doubt. A kind of spiritual undoing. The church, of course, frowned on such things, but the whisper remained. In time, the rule faded. As superstitions gave way to reason and the pace of life quickened, few could remember why the backward path had ever been cursed. And yet, in certain corners, the idea lingered. In old folk songs, in whispered cautionary tales, in the way a child still feels a flicker of unease when stepping backward just once on the middle day of the week. So, tonight, as you lie still and let the days fold softly into one another, think of the people who moved only forward, not from logic, but from faith. Think of the small steps that were watched and weighed, the way superstition shaped the body's motion. And know that now, your feet may rest in any direction they please. The day holds no curse. The shadows are quiet. The world does not mind if you retrace your steps or stay completely still. The law of feather ownership. The fire crackles low in the corner of the hall. Outside, the wind rattles shutters and whispers against stone. But inside, there is warmth of a kind. A servant shakes out the bed linens in the Lord's chamber, revealing a pillow so stuffed with feathers it seems to float for a moment before settling on the mattress. Below stairs, a scullery maid adjusts the thin straw ticking she calls her bed, and beside her, tucked beneath a fold of patched wool, lies a single feather. She is not supposed to have it, because in this manner, and many like it, there is a law. The ownership of goose feathers is restricted by class. It may seem strange, even absurd, but feathers, soft, ordinary feathers, were once objects of scrutiny. They were counted, regulated, taxed. They were proof of comfort, of privilege, and like most things that brought softness to a harsh world, they were watched. In many towns, laws were written to limit who could own feathers, and in what quantity. These sumptuary regulations, meant to keep the classes visually and materially separate, extended beyond clothes and jewels to include bedding. Only the gentry, and sometimes wealthy merchants, were permitted to sleep upon feather beds. The rest, straw, chaff, wool, if lucky. Feathers, especially from geese and swans, were prized. They offered warmth without weight. They breathed, they lasted, and they were expensive. A pillow filled with goose down might cost a laborer a month's wage. A feather mattress, a year's. Thus, the law. In England, a statute from the 14th century declared, "Let no yeoman nor villain keep feather bed nor bolster, save it be known to the steward and approved." Similar restrictions were echoed across France, the Low Countries, and parts of Germany. Enforcement came not just from officials, but neighbors. A peasant whose mattress seemed too soft might find himself questioned. A maid caught collecting fallen feathers from the castle yard could be fined. In one tale, a washerwoman was found to have sewn feathers into her blanket and was made to sleep without cover for a week as punishment and spectacle. There were exceptions, of course. A feather pillow might be allowed in a sick room, loaned from the manor, or a traveling guest of even modest means might receive a single feather bolster in the local inn to signal hospitality without violating the law. But even those small comforts were eyed carefully. People found ways to cheat. Some stuffed their beds with thistledown, softer than straw, but cheaper than feathers. Others mixed small amounts of feathers into straw bundles and swore ignorance. A few simply stole, plucking birds under cover of night, hiding the softest plumes in clay pots beneath the floorboards. One woman, a midwife, confessed on her deathbed that she had delivered 30 babies atop a hidden feather pad she carried in her satchel, so they might be born to softness, if not to wealth. So much weight for something so light. But such was the world, dear listener, where even the right to sleep in comfort had to be earned or inherited, where softness was rationed. where a feather could be the difference between pride and punishment. Tonight, as your head sinks into your own pillow, whether feathered or foam, new or old, remember the people who craved what you now take for granted, who chased softness in secret, who dreamed of floating just for a moment above the hard floor of the world. And rest well. No steward will come to count your feathers. The bed is yours. The law is long gone. Sleep as softly as you please. Thou shalt not fish with bread on Sundays. The river winds gently through the village like a silver ribbon, flanked by reeds and willow branches, its waters cool and slow beneath the pale gaze of morning. On most days, you'd find children skipping stones across its surface, old men hunched over cane rods, and washerwomen resting their baskets along the bank. But today is Sunday. The sun is just rising. The church bell tolls once, and a small sign beside the path bears a curious inscription. Fishing with bread on the Lord's day is forbidden. And so begins another quiet rule of medieval life. One both oddly specific and strangely serious. In several regions across England, France, and parts of the Low Countries, local councils and ecclesiastical courts once upheld the odd prohibition. You could not fish with bread as bait on a Sunday. Why bread? And why Sunday? The first part is simple. Bread, especially in towns and manors with regulated markets, was more than food. It was sacred provision. It represented labor, sustenance, and for many, survival. Bread was subject to rules: how it could be baked, what flour could be used, how it should be priced. To use it casually, frivolously, as bait for fish rather than mouths was seen as wasteful, and on Sunday, doubly so. Sunday, the day of rest, the day of worship, the day when even field hands and merchants were to set down their tools and turn their eyes toward higher things. To fish at all on a Sunday was frowned upon by some. But to fish with bread, the body of labor, as one abbot wrote, was considered an affront. Some laws were scrawled into the back pages of town records, others handed down through parish councils. A guild of bakers in a Flemish town petitioned the mayor to fine any man seen dipping loaves or rolls into the stream on holy days, claiming it diminished the dignity of their trade. In certain church records, fishing with bread was likened to mocking the Eucharist, though this was a stretch and likely more superstition than doctrine. Still, the rule held. There are accounts of men being fined for using stale crusts as bait. One boy, caught on the riverbank with a bag of breadcrumbs and a fishing pole, was marched to the rectory and told to recite the Lord's Prayer twice before being allowed to return home. Another man, more brazen, insisted that his bait was rye and therefore too lowly to offend the Lord. The priest disagreed. He spent the afternoon scrubbing the church steps. The deeper reason, though, was about reverence. Sundays were meant for reflection, for stillness, for keeping sacred things sacred. Bread was never just bread. It was toil transformed. To cast it into the water for sport, on a day meant for spiritual hunger, was to turn one's back on the rhythm of the week. Of course, people bent the rules. Some used cheese instead, or worms, or insects gathered from barns. Others fished before dawn, tucking away their lines before the first bell rang. A few claimed they were not fishing, but simply feeding the river. There was even a tale of a clever tanner who baked special loaves shaped like apples to disguise his bait. And still, the rule remained. If not always enforced, then remembered. In time, as bread became less precious and Sundays less rigid, the law faded. But the memory lingers, faint as a line cast into still water. A reminder of how even the smallest acts were once watched, measured, and weighed against a scale we no longer use. So tonight, as the world softens and the hush returns, picture the river again. Picture the boy with breadcrumbs in his hand, the old man glancing over his shoulder as he dips a crust into the current, the bell tolling in the distance, and then the line pulled taut, the fish caught, the quiet thrill of defiance. No one will find you now. No one will scold you for dreaming of bread and rivers on the same day. Sleep well, and let the fish swim free in your thoughts. The ban on pointed shoes that curve too much. In the candlelit shadows of a bustling town square, footsteps echo off stone. Not the heavy tread of laborers, nor the clatter of hooves, but something finer, something sharper. Curving upward, like the crescent moon itself, the tips of fashionable shoes trace impossible arcs through the dust. Their wearers strut with pride, their heels tapping with theatrical rhythm. And from the shadows, a watchman sighs and unfurls a scroll. Shoes with points exceeding 2 inches shall be fined. This, dear listener, was no idle rule. It was real, enforced in cities across Europe during the 14th and 15th centuries, particularly in England and France, where the fashion for pointed shoes, or poulaines, had reached absurd proportions. What began as a stylish flourish soon turned into what the authorities considered a threat to morality, order, and common decency. These shoes, elongated, curled, and often stiffened with whalebone or stuffed with moss, could reach lengths of 12 inches or more beyond the toe. The higher one's status, the longer the point. Nobles had them dyed in exotic colors, embroidered with gold, tipped with bells or pearls. Some were so long they had to be tied to the knees with laces to prevent tripping. But for the lawmakers, the trend was too much. City edicts began appearing, regulating not just the length, but the curve of these shoes. In London, a 1463 law forbade shoes with points longer than 2 inches beyond the toe for anyone under the rank of lord. In Paris, the curvature was measured by clerks using waxed strings. Shoes that bent too sharply, forming a hook or crescent, were declared vain and wicked. The church, too, frowned. Preachers called them devil's claws and claimed they led men into sin. A bishop once declared that the curled points resembled the horns of pride. They distracted from humility, from piety, from walking the straight path. The enforcement could be theatrical. Shoemakers caught crafting illegal points had their wares publicly slashed. A merchant wearing overly curved poulaines to mass was made to remove them and attend barefoot. Tailors were fined for enabling vanity. But the people loved their points. They competed, measured, whispered about who had the finest curve. Some nobles even wore false shoe extensions at court, made of dyed felt that flopped comically as they walked. The shoes became a statement of wealth, of rebellion, of identity. Common folk sometimes mocked the trend by wearing absurdly long paper shoes to festivals, poking fun at the elite. Others tried to imitate it in secret, adding stuffed points to their old boots, praying no reeve would notice. Eventually, the fashion faded. Rounded shoes returned. Simpler styles took over. But the laws lingered a while, like echoes in a long hallway, long after anyone cared to measure a toe. So tonight, as your own feet rest quiet beneath the blanket, untouched by fashion or decree, remember the walkers of the past, curving their steps like punctuation, watched and measured with every click of their heels, and sleep, knowing no one will find your dreams for straying a little too far ahead of your toes. The rule of the bare head. Before nobility. The chamber is warm, lit by fire and torch. The rushes beneath your feet freshly strewn with herbs. You are called forward, not with urgency, but with ceremony. A lord sits at the end of the hall, cloaked in velvet, his hands folded. You bow. You reach for your cap and pause. Because the law is clear, you must remove your head covering in the presence of nobility. In the medieval world, where status ruled every breath, one's head, covered or bare, was a symbol of submission, reverence, and place. The rule was this: no commoner may stand before a noble with his head covered. To do so was to presume equality. To presume equality was, in their eyes, to disrupt the divine order. This wasn't just a matter of fashion, it was law, recorded in court customs, carved into town ordinances, and reinforced by servants, reeves, and guards. To wear a cap, a hood, or even a scarf in the presence of titled blood was a statement. And unless you had royal license or some clever excuse, it was a punishable offense. In one notable case, a miller appearing before a magistrate forgot to remove his cap. He claimed his baldness was shameful. The judge claimed his insolence was worse. The man was fined and made to wear a tall, red cap in public for 3 days. A cap he could not remove, even when greeting others. Elsewhere, exceptions were made for illness, or extreme cold, or known skin ailments, but most simply obeyed. Removing the hat became automatic, like a bow, like a breath. Still, there were quiet acts of rebellion. A peasant girl once wore a wreath of woven reeds, not a hat, but not nothing, before a nobleman. He laughed. She did not. In that pause, something shifted. Even now, the gesture remains. In churches, in courtrooms, in customs we no longer question. But the law itself has vanished, filed away with so many others. Tonight, your head is your own. Covered or bare, seen or unseen, you owe no one the tilt of your cap. Rest, dear listener, and let the weight of hierarchy drift from your thoughts like a hat set gently down. The law of candle curfews. The sky darkens over the village like an ink spill, soft and steady. One by one, windows dim, doors shut. The tap room quiets. And from the tower, a bell rings 3 slow tolls. The signal has been given. The candle curfew has begun. In medieval towns across Europe, it was once the law. After the evening bell, no new candles were to be lit. This rule was partly practical, an early form of fire prevention. In tightly packed towns of timber and thatch, flame was both life and threat. A single spark, left unchecked, could raise half a city. The candle curfew sought to still the flames before sleep, to quiet the night not only in spirit, but in light. But it was also moral. Night was for rest, for prayer, for silence. To burn candles late was seen as indulgence, even sin. It suggested idleness, vanity, plotting. Towns posted wardens to walk the streets, checking for glow behind shutters. In Paris, the law was called couvre-feu, cover the fire, and it is from this that the word curfew comes. Those caught breaking it could be fined, shamed, or worse. In one story, a scholar, reading by candlelight after the bell, was dragged from his chamber and made to recite his book by moonlight alone. People found ways around it, banked coals beneath pots, used oil lamps with hidden wicks, read by the hearth's last glow. Others simply memorized what they needed before dusk. And so the world darkened, gently, night after night. Not just from sleep, but from law. From the quiet decree that said, enough light, enough labor. Let the shadows return. Tonight, your light may stay as long as you please. But when it fades and the dark returns, let it comfort rather than frighten. The curfew is only history now, and sleep is yours.